The idea that Africa had no great civilizations before Europeans arrived is one of the most widely believed and most completely wrong assumptions in popular history. Thousands of years before the British Empire existed, an African king named Musa I ruled a domain larger than Western Europe and was personally the wealthiest human being in all of recorded history. His 1,324 pilgrimage to Mecca was so extravagant. He traveled with 60,000 people and 100 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold, that his spending crashed the gold price across the entire Mediterranean world for more than a decade. The Mali Empire he ruled stretched across what is now Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, and parts of Mauritania and Ivory Coast, controlling the richest trans-Saharan gold trade routes on Earth. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu housed more than 50,000 students at its height, larger than any European university of the same period. So why, by 1900, was nearly the entire African continent divided up and ruled by European colonial powers? The answer involves geography, disease, the slave trade, and a set of very deliberate decisions made by 14 European governments at a single conference in Berlin. And none of it has anything to do with African civilizations being absent or primitive. In this video, we will cover what Africa actually built, and then explain exactly, step by step, why the continent entered the 20th century under colonial rule. The Kingdom of Kush in present-day Sudan existed from roughly 1070 BCE to 350 CE, building pyramids, developing its own writing system called Meroitic script, and simultaneously trading iron and gold with Egypt, Greece, and Rome. The Aksumite Empire in modern Ethiopia and Eritrea, running from roughly 100 CE to 940 CE, was one of the 4 largest economies in the world at its peak according to ancient sources, minting its own coinage while building 100-foot stone obelisks that still stand today. Great Zimbabwe, in modern Zimbabwe, built massive dry stone walls without a single drop of mortar between 1220 and 1450 CE, controlled the gold and ivory trade across the entire Indian Ocean network, and administered a regional political system spanning much of southern Africa's interior. The Songhai Empire, centered on the cities of Gao and Timbuktu between 1464 and 1591 CE, built a sophisticated bureaucratic administration and controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes that moved salt, gold, and other goods across the desert. The Kingdom of Kongo, established around 1390 CE, sent diplomatic ambassadors to the Vatican, maintained formal relations with Portugal, and adopted Christianity while preserving its own political structures completely intact. The Asante Empire in modern Ghana, founded around 1701, built one of the most elaborate political states in West Africa, controlled the gold trade of the region, and repeatedly defeated British colonial forces in battle before finally being absorbed in 1902. None of these civilizations were isolated or primitive. They traded actively with Europe, Asia, and the Arab world for centuries before the colonial period began. The notion that Africa was uncivilized before European contact is no longer defensible in any serious historical scholarship. It is, as historians increasingly recognize, colonial-era propaganda invented to justify conquest and kept alive because it was convenient. So what actually happened? Why did a continent with this much history enter the 20th century almost completely under foreign rule? The first major factor is geography, and it shaped African political development in ways that are rarely fully explained. Africa's interior presented unique challenges for building large-scale state systems in certain regions that European geography simply did not face. The Sahara Desert forms a massive north-south barrier across the continent, cutting off the Mediterranean coast from sub-Saharan Africa for most practical purposes of bulk land trade. The Congo Basin's dense tropical rainforest resisted large-scale organized agriculture and made long-distance movement of goods and armies extremely difficult across enormous stretches of the continent. Africa's great rivers, the Nile, the Niger, the Congo, the Zambezi, are interrupted at critical points by cataracts, waterfalls, and swamps that prevent the kind of continuous inland navigation that moved bulk goods across Europe. Europe's Rhine, Danube, Seine, and Thames formed connected networks of navigable water that moved heavy goods cheaply from the interior to coastal ports. making large-scale political and economic organization far more practical than Africa's river geography allowed in many regions. The second major factor is disease, and its role in shaping the history of colonization is rarely given enough attention. Africa south of the Sahara was home to some of the most lethal infectious diseases on Earth for non-immune populations. Malaria, yellow fever, sleeping sickness carried by tsetse flies, and river blindness, among others. European soldiers and explorers who entered the African interior during the early colonial period died at catastrophic rates from these diseases, which dramatically slowed the speed and depth of colonial penetration for several centuries. African populations had developed genetic resistances. The sickle cell trait provides significant protection against malaria, and immunological tolerances that Europeans simply did not possess. It was only the development of quinine as a malaria prophylaxis in the 1850 and 1860 that allowed European armies to penetrate the African interior in large numbers for the first time. And the full colonial scramble that followed came within just a few decades of that medical breakthrough. The third major factor is the transatlantic slave trade, and its damage to African political and demographic structures was both enormous and long-lasting. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic, with additional millions dying during capture in the African interior, during transport to the coast, or in captivity before they ever boarded a ship. The demographic damage was concentrated in West and Central Africa, exactly the regions most heavily contested during the late 19th century colonial scramble. The political damage was equally severe. Coastal African kingdoms were economically incentivized to wage war on each other, specifically to capture enslaved people for sale to European traders, destabilizing political alliances that had previously been far more complex and stable. The institutional damage, deep mistrust between ethnic groups, depopulation of skilled farmers and craftspeople, and the fragmentation of regional political coalitions reduced Africa's ability to organize unified resistance to European colonization when that colonization began accelerating. The fourth factor is the most recent and the most deliberately engineered European colonial economic policy, designed specifically to prevent African industrialization from developing. When European powers partitioned Africa in the late 19th century, they imposed economic systems deliberately structured to keep Africa as a supplier of raw materials and a market for European manufactured goods, not as an industrial economy in its own right. Tariff systems discriminated against African-produced goods in favor of European imports. Mining and agricultural concessions were structured to benefit European companies. Manufacturing sectors that had existed before colonization were systematically suppressed. Historians, including Sven Beckert, have documented how these structures were not accidental outcomes. They were explicitly designed policies intended to create economic dependency that would outlast the colonial period itself. The formal event that sealed Africa's colonial fate was the Berlin Conference, held from November 15, 1884 to February 26, 1885, at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, convened at the initiative of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The conference brought together 14 European powers, plus the Ottoman Empire and the United States, to formally divide the African continent. No African representatives were invited. Not a single African was present in the room, where the borders of an entire continent were drawn and assigned. The conference's General Act established the principle of effective occupation, meaning European powers could formally claim African territories only if they could demonstrate actual control on the ground, and divided Central Africa between competing colonial claims. The conference was partly triggered by King Leopold Roman II of Belgium's personal claim to the Congo Free State, which was formally recognized in the General Act, and handed Leopold private control over a territory 75 times the size of Belgium. In the decades following Berlin, European powers partitioned the continent with remarkable speed. France took most of West and North Africa, Algeria from 1830, Tunisia from 1881, and French West Africa consolidated through the 1890s. Britain took Egypt in 1882, Nigeria gradually from 1861 to 1914, Sudan jointly in 1899 after defeating the Mahdist state, Kenya in 1895, and large portions of East and Southern Africa. Germany took Tanganyika, Rwanda, Burundi, Cameroon, Togo, and Southwest Africa. Portugal held Angola and Mozambique. Italy claimed Libya, Eritrea, and parts of Somalia. Belgium took the Congo Free State. By 1914, only two African countries remained formally independent, Ethiopia and Liberia. And even Ethiopia was later invaded and briefly occupied by Italy between 1936 and 1941. The borders drawn during this entire process were largely arbitrary by African standards. They followed rivers and lines of longitude without any regard for ethnic boundaries, linguistic territories, or patterns of pastoral migration that had existed for centuries. Related communities were split between different colonial administrations. Historically unrelated and sometimes hostile communities were forced into the same colonial unit and expected to function as a single political entity from that point forward. Of the more than 50 modern African states, nearly everyone inherited borders drawn by Europeans who had often never set foot in the territories they were dividing on a map in Berlin. The result has been more than 30 border disputes since independence, including the Ethiopia-Eritrea War of 1998 to 2000, the Somalia-Kenya conflict over the Jubaland region, and the internal wars that followed South Sudan's independence. Despite all of this, the inherited borders have largely survived, partly because the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, made a deliberate decision in 1964 to accept colonial borders rather than risk cascading territorial disputes across the entire continent simultaneously. The logic was straightforward. Changing one border would open every border to challenge, and the instability that followed could be worse than the borders themselves. The debate among historians over Africa's post-independence development challenges is more complex than the colonial period alone can explain: Cold War proxy conflicts, 1980s debt crises enforced by international lenders, the resource curse dynamic where mineral wealth generates corruption instead of development, and infrastructure designed for extraction rather than domestic connectivity all play significant roles. But none of these factors reduce to the idea that Africa failed because its original civilizations were primitive, because the historical record completely refutes that claim. The Mali Empire, the Aksumite Empire, Great Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of Congo, and the Asante Empire all built political systems, trade networks, and cultural institutions that were by any objective measure comparable to the major civilizations of their eras. What happened to Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries was not a natural consequence of some inherent limitation. It was the result of specific policies, specific decisions, and specific forces applied from outside over several consecutive centuries. Understanding why requires holding all four of these factors together: geography, disease, the slave trade, and deliberate colonial economic engineering, not picking just one and ignoring the rest. If you want to go deeper on any of the specific African empires covered in this video, the full scale of Mansa Musa's wealth, the architecture of Great Zimbabwe, or the political organization of the Aksumite Empire, the next video on this channel covers each one in full detail.